Nighttime logic is a part or parts of the story that are felt but not consciously processed. It's also the name of our series. I'm your host, Daniel Braum. I'm the author of The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales. I'm introducing myself because the past few times, that's the part I forget. Today is Thursday, December 19th. It's near the end of the year. It's dark out there, so it's perfect to tell stories like they used to about the supernatural, like they did once upon a time. And I'm really happy to be here with Laird Barron. Welcome, Laird. It's so great to see you.
Hey Dan, good to see you again.
I'll introduce you for if it happens to be the uninitiated out here. Laird Barron spent his early years in Alaska. He is the author of several books, including The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All, The Wind Began to Howl, and Not a Speck of Light stories. This is the newest one that we'll be talking a lot about tonight. His work has appeared in many magazines and anthology. Barron currently resides in the Rondout Valley, writing stories about the evil that men do. Before we get started, if Laird winks in and out to the void or other places, we just have some connection issues sometimes, so he'll be right back if that happens, not to fear. And I want to say thanks again, Laird, for being here. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I think your fans, we won't go too much into it, I think your fans and readers already know that you're soldiering through some health issues as part of your recovery, so we really wish you all the best in your continued recovery, and an extra thanks for being here tonight.
I appreciate it.
It's great to see you, but I think I have more questions than we have time, so let's jump right to it. Congratulations on the new book. I really enjoyed it. I've read it cover to cover, and even by your high standards, it's excellent. So it was a great read. So if any of you out there don't have this book yet, please check it out. You're in for a treat. The book's called Not a Speck of Light, and the very first thing in the book is a quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I think that goes, the little excerpt is, at first it seemed a little speck, and then it seemed a mist. It moved and moved and took at last a certain shape. So I wanted to ask you about that. There's, I noticed there's a connection to that, that excerpt, the word speck, which is in the title of the book. And there's a lot of things in this book, in the collection of stories that are assembled here, that do have something ambiguous or indiscernible in them. And upon reading them and reading the quote, like, yeah, often these indiscernible elements, they do take focus and take a shape, even if it's not totally revealed. But I think you give us enough to know that, yeah, this indiscernible thing that I'm writing about may not give you the ecology of supernatural, but it's something horrific. Why did you choose the Coleridge quote to begin the book?
The obvious choice initially was the Rower song by Roald Dahl, which of course has a phrase in there, not a speck of light.
Which song is that? A story, or
it's called the Rower song. It's in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder and company back in the late 60s, or late 60s, and there's a scene in there where Wilder takes them through the tunnel. It's like a little boat ride, like a tunnel of love kind of thing. Yeah. And he's quoting. That's the song. That's the poem he's quoting. And I really would like to have used it, but I also like the Coleridge quote. And I use the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, pieces of it, in several of my books, and I kind of wanted to keep that also. So instead of trying to go get the rights to, it's harder to get rights to a song because it's not a poem. I had thought that maybe it had been a poem that Dahl had written prior to the movie, but it looks like it's a song, and you don't want to mess with that. So I just stuck with so I went with Plan B or A minus or whatever. But yeah, And also the description of the shape, but that's death approaching, that's doom approaching. And I just thought the book is kind of redolent with that.
Yeah, death and doom definitely does approach your characters in this book. I Wow, it's cool to hear that there's a Roald Dahl connection there. I've recently I'm watching right now his show Tales of the Unexpected, Tales of the Unanticipated. Have you ever seen
Mm-mm.
this program?
No.
I was like today years old almost that I realized that he wrote adult fiction and adult short stories,
Oh, really? Yeah, he's one of the greats. He's
and
like
they're
one of the great
dark.
horror writers. Yeah, he's a horror writer.
They're dark. They're dark. I just really looked at him with new eyes. So it's a delight, and it's not really a surprise to know that you think of Roald Dahl. Then
He's
uh,
he's in my little top shelf list.
yeah, he's an interesting guy. It's weird how they roll him out sort of like Rod Serling, but he just looks a little unkempt and disheveled, and he doesn't look. He's not the suave host. Like he's just like, I'm Roald Dahl, and he
I
just
can
has this
relate.
crazed look in his eyes when he introduces like these really grim but really effective. At least these are adaptations that just actually inspired me to pick up bunches of his work. So I'm looking
Good.
forward to
You
that.
can't. He was a genius.
Yeah, looking at what a surprise to think that. Yeah, um, going from cover to cover here. I'm going to skip before we dive right into the stories. You also wrote an afterword for the book. I'll quote a little bit of that. For me, every collection is a battle fought in a war of attrition that we all lose in the end. Our best hope is to leave something of ourselves behind, a token of the joy, suffering, and turmoil that make up a life. Literature is my gesture against the dark. Um, how much multi-directional question you could hit on any of it? How much of you, like the real you, finds its way into the stories, and um, how if it's not you, how do these translations or how does the alchemy find its way? And could you give us an example of that, maybe in a story?
Oh, I think it's a fallacy that there's, or a misapprehension of the old adage, the old saw, don't conflate the artist with the art. And I think that's safe and fair because um, there is a delineating line, no matter how much of yourself is in a fictional story. Um, but there's going to be something of yourself, if nothing else, a worldview. I decided, when I first started publishing, I wasn't worried about any kind of a message, and I still am not necessarily trying to transmit a message, but I was more interested in neutrality the first 10 or 15 years of my writing, publishing career. And these days, I'm,
What do you
probably
mean?
at least,
What do you mean by neutrality? Neutrality in terms of not having any message other than the dramatic structure of the characters.
yeah, and also knowing, you know, don't uh, even on any level have a moral point of view in the stories. They just are stories, and obviously they probably still, looking back, I probably wasn't skilled enough to make them neutral. But the point was, is as time went on, I became less interested in that and more interested in uh, imbuing my point of view. Um, Not to say that I empathize. I mean, because I write about a lot of characters that I don't have any, they're not related to me philosophically. But um, I still feel like the overall, you can kind of get where I'm coming from if you read a lot of my work, and I think it's important. I think the best artists have a point of view.
One of my earliest teachers said to me when talking about this topic, I think he described stories as maybe boxes about what they contain and what they deliver to the readers. And I think he said the first thing a story has to do, under this postulation, is a story has to entertain, whether or not you want to deliver a message or not. A story has to grip and entertain the reader, and then if it wants to have a message about any other part, those come next. But yeah, I think there are a lot of things that we can take away from your work. In addition to the entertainment value, like just the face value of like, yeah, these are stories. We go for a ride. We've been entertained and we enjoy them. But the thing that came to mind and is the first thing to me, at least for me, one of the things that I took away from the book, and perhaps it is a neutral thing, is the sense. For me, it was the sense of Alaska. So I'm a big. I think you're a big fan of him too. I'm a big fan of Lucius Shepard, and
Yep.
one of the great joys about Lucius Shepard's writing is the sense of place that you get with Shepard stories, and that's just was something that delighted me as a young reader, and that's what I love. And yeah, one of the things that was a delight about this book was how much of Alaska appears in certain groups of stories. So um, I'll just read a couple of little episodes. And so, for me, as someone who I haven't been to Alaska, that's part of why I show up for a reading. I'm like, oh, I want to feel a sense of place. I want to feel like I've been there. One of the earlier stories in the book, Blood in My Mouth. Alaska is a damned big, empty place bordered by nowhere, between frigid temperatures and snowfalls, ass deep to a giraffe. It has the weapons to kill anything more complex than a rock. Civilization exists in a tiny, disenfranchised pocket surrounded by a howling void. Basically, it's the universe in a microcosm. I thought that was a great bit of description. And we have another one from In a Cavern in a Canyon, another story from the first part of the book. Eastern settlers had carved a hamlet from wilderness during the 1920s, plunked it down in a forgotten vale populated by eagles, bears, drunk teamsters, and drunker fishermen. Mountains and dense forest on three sides formed a deep water harbor. The channel curved around the flank of Eagle Mountain and eventually let into Prince William Sound. Roads were gravel or dirt. We had the cruise ships and barges. We also had the railroad. You couldn't make a move without stepping in seagull shit. Most of us townies lived in a 14-story apartment complex called the Fraser Estate. Terra Incognita began where the sodium lamplight grew fuzzy. At night, wolves howled in the nearby hills. Just bravo. I mean, I just love that stuff. It just makes there's so much more happening in your stories, but I love that Alaska is really present. What I think everyone knows that you were born and raised from Alaska, and now you're on the east coast of the U.S. and somewhat depending on where you are, if you're in upstate or not quite upstate New York. What's are there any differences, perhaps maybe in terms of your writing, or any differences that come to mind about the two places?
Between the two coasts.
Or no, just Alaska and where you are now. Anything that inspired your writing, or just anything that just like, oh, it's coming to your mind when I ask it to you?
No, three places, the three major places I've lived inspire me, and I'd say almost equally: Alaska, Washington State, and now I've been in New York State for 13 years. So I feel, like my first weekend is over, and and a lot of my writing now, you'll notice this book is, kind of half it's Alaska, the other half is New York State. And I have written a lot of my recent stories have been New York State stories. There's a dramatic difference between Alaska and pretty much anywhere else I've been, except possibly like with parts of the Midwest, like if you're going across Wyoming or something like that. But what's funny is there's almost a direct comparison though between Washington State, where I lived for almost 17 years, and here on the East Coast. They're like a negative of each other. They're very, very, very similar. It's just that on the West, in Pacific Northwest, there's more, conifers and whatnot. But I remember moved over here. It was like, outside the fact that it's a little cooler in the wintertime or chillier in the wintertime, it's this weird negative of the Pacific Northwest. And But Alaska is just, it's, sui generis. It's just its own thing.
Is it the what is it that it's so unique about it? Is it the sense of danger? Is it the isolation? Is it just something even more mundane than that?
And I don't think it's unique in this aspect. I think there's places you could go that would, other countries, other locations that are similar. I'm sure if I went to Scotland, I'd probably, or Scandinavia, I'm sure I'd get some of this. But with Alaska, for me, it's just this sense of how old it is and just how unwelcoming. It's just not. It's, especially in the wintertime, it's just not a welcoming landscape. It almost actively rejects your presence like an antibody would a germ.
Mm. Wow. Um, yeah, that does not sound welcoming. I mean, that sounds quite horrific. One of the things I noticed, what a reader will notice about the book, and let me just take a second here to welcome all of our listeners and our readers. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Laird Barron, his latest book, Not a Speck of Light. It's the new story collection. So welcome, everyone. You've got some of your fans and readers saying hi to you, Laird, in the comments. So the first section, the book's divided into, you group the stories into sections. One of them, the first one is called Blood Red Samaritan, and yeah, I noticed there were recurring elements of specs in all four of those stories, and I'll mention them as we come to it. I think the first story is called In a Cavern in a Canyon, and there's the narrator's father has disappeared in the story. So part of the story is different points in this character's searching for his father in different points in time and different places. The one point I wanted to mention to you is at one point the narrator tells us, life is messy and mysterious. I didn't crack the case. I didn't get any sense of closure. So I like that this story appeared as the first story, and that I took that little bit of the narrator, not quite breaking the fourth wall, but he was saying it to a character, I believe, that was sort of, it operates perhaps as a cipher or a key to your fiction, or perhaps maybe the category or area of your fiction. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. I remember maybe a few years back, you were in conversation with a bunch of other authors, one of them quite notable, and I think he or she was talking about horror, and he was saying, like, yeah, horror is about the good guys fighting the bad guys and finding it in themselves to overcome evil and feeling good in the end. And I think, like, when it came to you, you were just like, yeah, no. You just gave like this flat no, and I was just like, so yeah, there's so many. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that kind of structured, linear, good versus evil, good prevailing, feel good horror. Yeah, like there's definitely a part for it, and yeah, we even like it. But tell us your thoughts about the indiscernible, that stuff you're mentioning in the Coleridge quote, the unknowable, the ambiguous, the messy, as that character says, as it pertains to the portrayals of the supernatural, and thus the structure of your stories.
Right. This particular group, that's a really great, observation. I consider this a horror collection just because there's so much horror in it. But I agree with people I've been in conversation with that it's as much a weird fiction collection. That may be more rightly weird if you started sifting it and weighing it on two scales there. But yeah, I have become increasingly, like with the last collection, Swift to Chase, I've become increasingly invested in the weird, like foregrounding the weirdness. I do it in my crime series. There's horror elements. There's always going to be horror elements in most of my work, but I'm really working to let the freak flag fly when it comes to weird fiction. And part of the deal for me with weird fiction is that weird would be almost like the superseding. It's like the overarching genre, and there's little horror maybe is a baby genre out of it. And so I look at weird, that weird doesn't have to be horror, but a lot of horror is weird. For me, weird is basically a destabilization of hopefully the reader's perceptions, but definitely the viewpoint characters they're either not quite understanding what's happening, and there's never going to be necessarily a good explanation to neatly tie it up, or what they're doing is inscrutable and the audience is, it's opaque to the audience. That the rules are basically transgressed. That you're in alien country. That the laws of physics maybe don't work like you thought. Time doesn't work like you thought. There's some kind of slippage of sanity, and that may or may not come with some kind of concomitant threat, like a horror story would. It could just be, it's just an experience. It's inscrutable, and a lot of the stories in this particular collection, they might have messy endings. They may not tie up neatly, but there's a lot of elements in them where there's like almost like a meta element in some of the stories, and I it's something that has been sort of naturally developing in my voice for a few years now, and some people love it and some people most definitely don't.
Oh, there's a lot to love in there. Really well said. I love that you said weird is a destabilization of perceptions. And yeah, horror and weird fiction they're often so close together, right? And I like that you said that. Yeah, sometimes I like how you said that sometimes weird fiction doesn't necessarily have that horror. I forgot what you said, but like that horror focal point, or that horror, like a monster or a big
like a
bad,
like a threat.
And I just immediately thought of maybe the granddaddy of weird fiction, perhaps Blackwood's The Willows.
Sure.
That is, there isn't necessarily a threat there, but there is a destabilization of perception for sure, and it may be ominous, and it may or may not. They may or may not be headed for trouble in that story, but yeah. So maybe like The Willows is skewing weird, and then we have all sorts of other. It's great. It's great to hear your view on it. How then there are other stories that just might be horror, and a lot of the stories in Not a Speck of Light they're horror to me, in at least, even if it doesn't have a monster or a threat or a big bad. There is definitely a threat. A threat of sanity, a threat of desires or what the characters want, or even a threat of just winding down of their life, or a threat of winding down of the entire world, even if those characters aren't in it. Sure. And those often, they come side by side. I have a lot. I'll have to ask you in more than one question, especially about these meta elements. And as I have some questions, I do want to ask you about how this comes into play in your crime novels. Another description of Alaska before I move on to the next one. This one is from Girls Without Their Faces On. This is a description of Anchorage. Hillside East was heavily wooded, murky at high noon, and impenetrable come the witching hour. Neighborhoods snaked around ravines and subarctic meadows and copses of deep forest. Cul-de-sacs might host a house or a bear den, but that was Anchorage. 250,000 souls sprinkled across 1,700 square miles, a slightly suburbanized wilderness, ice water to the left, mountains to the right, aurora borealis weeping radioactive tears. October nights tended to be crisp. Termination dust gleamed upon the Chugach peaks on its way down like a shroud, creeping even lower through the trees. A couple of questions back, you said, Alaska is just so inhospitable, almost like antibodies rejecting something. And yeah, maybe that's the weird, like the destabilization, or even like the almost inherent horror in the weird, like the inherent, even if there isn't a tangible threat. Yeah, Alaska's like, yeah, you're in trouble just for being here. And in a weird fiction story, even if there isn't a perhaps a Dracula or a bad guy, even though there are some of them, yeah, there's an inherent threat of the unknown and instability. The next section of the book is called Wandering Stars. Tell us how you used the ambiguities in the story Jorn Falls, which is that's a New York State set story.
Yes, it is.
It's a retired couple, Larry and Vonda, in Kingston, New York, and they do come across an ambiguous phenomenon. How did you use the ambiguity in that story?
Yeah, that's one of the more straightforward story, monster stories. And
Jorn Falls?
mm-hmm.
Okay, that's fascinating take. Fascinating.
But I wrote that for Tor Nightfire had a series of chat books, and they invited me to submit, and so I worked with Teresa DeLucci and Ellen Datlow on that story. I think the ambiguity in that story is you've got there's a focal point, there's a noise in the attic, there's something in the attic, and of course, since this is in a horror collection, and it was originally published in a horror, line of chat books, you kind of know what you're getting into. So I figured that the ambiguity had to be that there's one obvious threat, but that there's other things going on, especially between the couple. And I also, in that story, I know from personal experience and anecdotal observation, just that breakups aren't always as they're portrayed in your typical potboiler horror, where people are mad at each other and throwing things and jumping out of the car, moving car, and walking through the cornfield, that kind of thing. It's a lot of times it's a Cold War. Things are very civil. The barbs are all very personalized, bespoke. So I wanted to portray the couple as kind of poisoning each other, but in a way that if you just read it casually, they seem like they're getting along okay. But that the real the real horror of the story is more than just the creature. But one quick aside about that story, I got the idea to write it. I was sitting in my office in this old country house we were renting, the top floor, and I heard just all hell broke loose over in the ceiling above me, and there was some kind of a squirrel or something had broken into the house. The attic vent had been broken in a storm. We had a hellacious storm, and it had been cracked, and so the squirrel somehow got over there and then was trying to live upstairs. So we shooed him out of there, and a handyman who may or may not be very similar to Roger Miller in that story fixed it. And as he was up there thumping around, of course, I was like, what if it isn't a squirrel? What if it was something that's supposed to be the squirrel, something small, but it's much bigger? What would that look like?
Squirrel horror. Not only the horror of home repair, but the horror of, is it a squirrel? Is it a monster? I was that's fascinating to hear your focus and the genesis of those ideas. I was so focused on that handyman, and maybe again it's self-fulfilling prophecy of what I'm looking for in a story. I found that story to be so Aikman-esque in my take, because I was just not convinced about whether what was supposed to be supernatural, that eventually there was like this artifact from a Japanese place. Yep. What was causing the changes in the handyman Roger, or if this was just a psychological catalyst in why Roger was increasingly perhaps a creepy or going through changes. But hey, whatever it was, it definitely lended itself to multiple interpretations, and I love that. I love when you have a story where you're like, hey, that was a story about this, and you were like, oh, I thought it was a story about peanut butter. No, I thought it was a story about chocolate. And I totally just had that reaction when you were like, yeah, that was so it was great. I love that in there. Another story in that section is the blood in my mouth, and I want to just check my notes to make sure I've got this one right. Yeah, okay. This was a wild story. Yeah, but before I talk about the story, so I don't forget, I think in the blood in my mouth there. Am I wrong in seeing? Are there a couple of Easter eggs to the Isaiah Coleridge universe in there? So yeah, at a couple of points, I think one of the main characters is Erica, and I think she does talk about her departed brother, or talks about her brother Isaiah. Is that the hero of Blood Standard and the crime novels?
No, but it's yes and no, but not. It's not ours. Like if you recall in that story, she starts talking about they come from elsewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, it's. I wrote it before the.
I did notice, that it predated by a couple of years. Yeah, so I was wondering what their.
But I was writing the novel about the same time, so because it took me a while to write the novel, so they were written like I wrote this story, but I wrote Coleridge right after it, and
okay.
I kept that. At first, I was like, oh, I used that, and I'm like, no, just that's an alternate universe version.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, as things are being formed, their names are coming down in there, but yeah, there's a cool moment in the story. I don't know why it stands out to me, but yeah, we have our readers are saying, I think Mike and Anita say, I love the blood in my mouth.
Hey guys.
Something about that story. There's one point where I think the character is talking about a memory of her dad. It's not even her memory, about saying like there was a Lake Iliamna, and saying like, dad was a bush pilot, and he claims he saw like these big whale-like things in there. There's this big pot of monsters in there, and that's maybe all you get of like perhaps the overt Lovecraftian connection to it. I think the story was published in a book of Lovecraftian stories.
Yep, good old St. Joshi bought that.
Okay, but what I liked about it is it seemed to be, at least to me, and I'm also pretty much an uninitiated and a newbie about that stuff. It didn't seem to have any direct references to perhaps mythos, and more just it was a weird fiction, and perhaps a different direction of weird fiction. You mentioned perhaps the meta levels, or
yeah, I don't consider it. It's not really a horror story. It's a weird, a fantasy science fiction weird fiction tale.
Are these two mutually exclusive? Like, right? Like, is this such a thing that to perhaps just people like you and I, or when we're like, right, we're weighing the scales of difference, or
between what? Between what?
I don't know, between weird fiction and fantasy and science fiction, like, I mean,
I think I don't think it matters. I delineate them in my mind, but
yeah, it is fun to delineate them, because that's what we do. But yeah, that was a wild story. I really enjoyed it. I'm having trouble even like forming a question for you, because other than just like, there were so many fun little scientific postulations that were just thrown out there to give like verisimilitude. Yeah, like one point, the character is talking about like, like Voyager. Yeah, Voyager went out there, and there are consequences to that. Like there's like this insinuation that that caused some unwanted attention from some science fiction elements. That was just a real joy to read. And there were a lot of music elements. There's a lot of Cure and Pixies lyrics and references popping up, and these wild characters going through this, almost like this. I'm thinking almost like a Juliette Lewis and Woody Harrelson romp happening in this story, and then there's like weird fiction ensues like a bomb around them. But let's we have a limited amount of time, and I want to ask you something about each of the sections. This third group of stories. Ellen Smithy is dead. Can I spoil, if someone doesn't know what that means? Can I spoil what that term means now?
Feel free.
So I had to look it up. I sensed, I didn't I didn't know what it was, but I sensed that there is definitely a film connection to these stories. But I was just like, what am I missing? What's the other thing? So when I looked it up, Alan Smithy is apparently a pseudonym name that filmmakers once used. Someone else spoiled it when they want to disavow a project, like due to a studio fight or for any reason. If they don't want their name on the credits, it's like, yeah, Blade Runner, the TV cut by Alan Smithy or such. Apparently, the internet tells me screenwriter Joe Esterhaus notoriously spilled the secret. I guess he did a documentary called Burn, Hollywood Burn, where I think he was the magician revealing the tricks, and he told everyone that Alan Smithy is not real. He's a dumping ground. So other than the stories in this section, which all I believe have a filmmaking element in them, is there a reason that you gave the section these stories that name? Alan Smithy is dead.
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. One, it's I felt like it ties into Fear Son. It was sort of playful. I could see the entity in that. If he had written a script, would eventually said, Alan Smithy, not the Gray Eminence. So there's for me that would have sufficed. But there's another element to it, and that is, obviously there's some filmic qualities to the various stories. There's some, not necessarily a direct or important component, but there's something related in all of them. But the other major element, and this is, I don't know if anybody ever get it, but I'm a big David Lynch fan.
Okay.
And I kind of feel like the collection owes a bit of a debt to Lynch. Some of the stories do. Especially
which
stories? Like Girls Without Their Faces On would be one.
Okay.
They would have a strong Lynch. Nothing in there is Lynchian, but it's, Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks and Inland Empire and stuff like that. Lost Highway, and brings us to Lost Highway. So basically, there's a recurring line that is uttered in Lost Highway. Somebody will on the intercom will whisper in the intercom. They'll go, "Dick Laurent is dead." So that was just, I was like, Alan Smithy's dead, because it's a subliminal. It's basically an unconscious thing, but so it's not really intended for anyone to consciously get it. But anybody who's watched Lost Highway and loved it, and then sees that title on the back of their mind, that's gonna like, what is that? It's kind of bugging me. What is that?
Okay, so it's not, you're not disavowing these stories, or the reverse. No. If Alan Smithy,
I've seen that theory too. Is that I didn't like those stories, and I had to contractually include 4 stories. No, it's playful.
I mean, that's the surface level of it. I'm like, was he doing that? But Alan Smithy is dead, so that's a negative. So does that mean, is it a reversal? Are these, you definitely, it's definitely playful in there, especially that there are a lot of films being made and a lot of film crews, and are these the more meta stories? Like, even though they're perhaps not directly related, though maybe I'm seeing an overlapping character. There are a lot of conspiracies, these government agencies. There are these secret projects that unwind, these Gnostic-like elements that seem to unwind.
Right.
Yeah. Is that the meta weird?
That's quite a bit of it, and a certain amount of self-awareness in the Mace stories. Mace isn't quite aware that she's in a horror or weird fiction series, but she almost aware. Kind of like we're all suspicious that I'm suspicious that we're all part of a hologram. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, you could see, right, there is that Gnostic, right, like level in there, to that character, and as the stories unwind, that becomes more and more to it there. It seems like that's almost, is that could that be a hallmark of a certain subdivision, or just a certain trope of weird fiction, like these? You did say there was a destabilization of sanity, but a destabilization of perception or perception of truth. That does seem to fit in well with a character who is going more and more down a rabbit hole of a conspiracy or a secret that's real.
Sure.
I feel that way a lot about noir stories, and your Coleridge crime novels are certainly have that noir element, at least that a detective or a hero who's getting in and the world is expanding around him. How do you feel that noir and crime relates to horror and weird fiction, at least for you?
Yeah, I wrote an essay a few years ago about that, and
Oh,
essentially they're cousins, and they, horror and noir go together quite nicely. Angel Heart, my
ah,
favorite.
yeah.
And even something oblique like Smell a Sense of Snow. There's a cosmic horror element to that. If you squint.
Which one is that?
Smell a Sense of Snow. It was written in the '90s, and a movie. I want to say it was Sandra Bullock played the lead in that. Um, yeah, and it takes place, out on the ice, and they found something out
Ah,
there, but it's a crime, or excuse me, it's a like a thriller mystery, but it has noir elements, and it has definitely has some horror elements tucked away in there. So like, and as far as my writing development is concerned, I was weaned on pulpy stuff and westerns and hard-boiled crime and thrillers. So I came to that. There was horror mixed in because I also read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe right from an early age. So there you go. But I would say, generally speaking, up until I was in my teens and got into Stephen King and Robert R. McCammon and Dean Koontz and all the Clive Barkers and stuff, I read mostly crime and thrillers and mysteries and things. So when I eventually turned to writing horror, it was really natural though for me to inject the horror into the kind of into the form of the actual skeletal structure of the story of the noir or crime or mystery story, but it will have this horror element. And
seems like
then
it does fit right in.
yeah, and so I think they're and it's acceptable. You can have a tiny little bit of occultism or mysticism in a hard-boiled crime. People who would not normally read horror whatsoever would reject it. Will accept a little bit of supernatural horror in their in their noir.
Or even sometimes I find in stories like that, even if the pendulum doesn't fall or land on the supernatural, even if it is simply something that's wrapped up and it's so unexplained or so weird, at least I'm feeling the tension and I love it when there's that tension where I'm just not sure. I'm
Sure.
like, is it going to fall that way?
Paul Tremblay's really excellent at that.
Yeah, Tremblay's great in that. And now I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was the most recent, for me, it operated that way. The most recent True Detective one where
Oh, right.
I thought it was delightful. It was just like, hey, which way did it fall? I can't tell you, but like the tension remained. They did a great job, in my opinion, of maintaining the tension of the possibility between the two of that right till the end, right to the unexplained nature of the end. And I was just like, 10
Yeah,
stars, 10 out of 10 on that. It was a delight to see that.
I enjoyed the series quite the latest.
And Poe, you mentioned Poe is perhaps the first supernatural detective
Yeah.
as well. So it's going right back to it. Before I move on, may I ask you, is that essay published in a place where we might check it out about the horror and noir?
Yeah, it's on my Patreon, but you can also get it
Okay.
at Crime Reads. You
So
can
how does one tell us about your Patreon and how someone would connect with you on there, Laird?
Oh yeah, my Patreon's just at Laird Barron, dot Patreon, the realm of old leech.
Okay.
Yeah, there's multiple tiers you can join for free. And I post fairly frequently on the free level, several times a month. And then there's a $5 tier, which you get like basically what you get there is commentary, recommendations. What am I up to? Newsletters, that kind of stuff. Then there's a $10 tier, $10 and $25 tier, and for those you get I release like stories that haven't been reprinted anywhere. Maybe sometimes you get excerpts. There's a $50 tier, and I actually have it's a very small group of people, and I have a video chat with them once a month, and they also get
That's cool.
secret prizes and things.
Yay. Yeah, one of the stories I want to ask you about before time runs out was mentioned that it was published on was that the last story in the book published on your Patreon? The one about the dog and the circles. What's its name? Not soul, but ghost of your old dog.
You won't be saved, right?
Okay.
No,
We'll get to that.
I don't think that's on my Patreon. I don't.
Okay.
It was it was originally years ago. It was published on my
your author site. Was that
my author site? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and Crime Reads, that's a website. Crime Reads, we can
Crime Reads, just punch in Laird Barron. I have a couple essays there, and one's about crime and horror, and the other one is about the power of geography and literature.
Cool. I will definitely be checking that out.
And there's lots of great. I mean, they're constantly roping in great writers to do.
And your Patreon sounds great. So you've got it. If there's a way just to have more about Laird or send some support his way, you've got that. You know where to find that Patreon. The last few questions that we have time for, I want to make sure I ask you about Not a Speck of Light, which is that's the title story. That's a cool story in that it presents. It does a thing that I like a lot about stories of fiction. I don't even know if there's a term for it, but it sort of presents and sets up as a ghost story. I like stories that kind of present as one thing, but then they land somewhere else. Definitely presents as a ghost story or a haunted house story. And there's a dog, Aardvark, a rescue dog, and it's a Catskill story. So there's a lot of foreshadowing where like the dog is foreshadowing that there's something wrong about the house. But would you say like does the story take a science fictional or weird turn, or at least with the whole secondary world, otherworldly element of it? Tell perhaps it almost felt like Clark had like some overtones of Clark Ashton Smith.
Sure.
Yeah, right? Like I was getting that Clark Ashton Smith vibe. So tell us about secondary worlds or secondary spaces, maybe even specifically our character. It sort of is a great ending where the story ends up with a character. You mentioned the negative space between the West Coast and the East Coast, and I'm looking at my notes, and I found like the story ended almost I interpreted it as being like a negative space between the opening of the story and the ending of the story. There's a character, Andy, and the story sort of begins with him in his house, and it ends with him in this secondary world, almost in the same way that was just, while not specific and discernible, it definitely had an energy and emotion to it. What will you tell us about that secondary world and that character?
That secondary world is alluded to as possibly a Lagerstadt, which is a story that I wrote years and years ago. It was in, I want to say it was an occultation, and it's just this idea.
Lagerstadt? Is that the name of a place or a concept?
It's German for basically a resting place. It's like not a burial ground, but like a graveyard, and it's also kind of used in fossil terminology. The idea that there's this repository, and all this stuff ends up there. And I used it in a spiritual sense, that like it's a purgatorial, that there's a place where everybody's consciousness goes. And maybe this, obviously the secondary world is very purgatorial. At least that's how it felt to me when I was writing it. But that story is meta. I mean, obviously all the characters in this, every major character in that story is somebody that is an industry person or somebody that I personally know. It's
really,
yeah,
okay.
Kind of alludes to them. I mean, you've got John D. Seems awful lot like a John Langan to me.
Okay.
Paul Wooster and whatnot. So there's a little bit of that, although that's not really that's not really important. It's it's I was trying to do spin multiple plates at once with that one. And it also is I want to say the fourth or fifth story in that sequence. There began with Joran Falls. There's Joran Falls, there's Strident Caller, there's American Remake, and I guess and then Not a Speck of Light. But you'll notice
They are Catskill stories, and they are
they're all in the
Catskills.
same two. They're all in the same two houses. All the stories,
Ah,
right? So like
okay.
the couple in Not a Speck of Light are living in the house that the couple in Joran Falls were living in.
Oh, I
They
missed that.
reference them. The couple died. They left the place, and now we've got
I got.
filmmaker.
They felt like the same kind of house, but I missed that they were the same house. But that's going to be fun to reread them. In
Well, and
addition,
right, like in the Jessica May story, a filmmaker, her buddy, the filmmaker, who's also in other stories of mine, he had bought the place from after they left. One died, and the other one left, and then they left it, which I talk about somewhere else, and then obviously,
yeah, that's fun. It's fun to have that.
and none of it's important if you just come to it. If you just flip through the whole book and read that story only, it
But it's
shouldn't
still
work.
fun.
It has nothing to. You don't have. In other words, you'll get everything you need to out of it. It's just if you start reading my other stuff, you'll go, wow, you can come back and read that story again.
But even if you're not consciously processing it, like it still operates to give a verisimilitude in the way that Aikman stories work, because you believe in that world, and you need to be grounded in believing in that world. And your world, as someone who I'm very familiar with the Catskills, I believed it. Whether or not you'd ever been to the Catskills, I know you're there and you haven't, but it's important in fiction, if you're going off on these flights of fancy, and the farther astray you go, at least the Aikman model is the more grounded you need to be in the real world. And that definitely
and
helps
Aikman is somebody that I emulate.
Yeah, and incredible and that's the highest praise that I can deliver. Yeah, especially in these group of stories, they felt wholly you, but yeah, they felt like they were along that they felt Aikman-esque, at least in that part of the neighborhood. And
I will say that
what a delight that is. It's absolute delight.
He's a gray eminence. A lot of, especially Commonwealth writers, the Brits and such. There's a certain writer over there, some Canadians, that they definitely are channeling Aikman in their stuff, and do, to varying degrees, do a great job. I'm equally influenced, but I could never aspire to the level of just natural obliqueness that he, that either I think you're born with it or you don't have it. You don't have to acquire it. And so my take on Aikman is to simply respond to Aikman in my own voice. In other words, to wear his influence, but not try to actually, replicate him. Because I see a lot of writers, they do work hard to replicate him.
Okay, and I haven't come across that. That might rub me the wrong way. I'm not sure.
Generally speaking, I think it's homage. But I just, for me, I could probably write a Aikman story that aped his inimitable style, but I'm not interested in doing that. And I think it'd be a fool's errand. So, but I do love where his eye was pointed.
Yeah. Some different writers feel differently about that. I remember, may he rest in peace, the great Peter Straub loved Robert Aikman and loved to talk about Robert Aikman. And if you asked him about it, like many a time I asked him about Robert Aikman, and he was like, "It can't be done. You can't write an Robert Aikman story. I, Peter Straub, have tried. It cannot be done." But there is he does have I believe Mr. Aikman's Air Rifle is one of Straub's stories, but there's some other authors you ask them, some prominent weird fiction, you ask them, sure, of course it can be done. Here's how you do it. There's a continuum on that, but yeah, it's great to just keep him in mind, and to write a story in his territory without trying to do what he does. But yeah, I found the influence delightful, Laird. The stories felt delightfully Aikman-esque, without feeling derivative, or just like, they, just more like, that's what I was getting at from the start with I call it like the intentional ambiguities and the using certain elements with intention, and perhaps we're just ascribing that to Aikman as yeah, he's maybe one of the first, or the person we associate that part of literary town with.
Yeah, he gave me permission slip.
Yeah, yeah. We'll get ready to wrap it up. I don't want to keep you more than an hour. But I do have like my last question here. I two stories that I'm going to call two dog stories. One is from part 3. One is from part 4. The story is Soul of Me, and the other story is You Won't Be Saved by the Ghost of Your Old Dog. Soul of Me is perhaps maybe it's the most overtly science fiction of them all, because it deals with for better a robot or an artificial dog, and it is the survivor or a survivor of a post-human, post-apocalyptic world. And then the book closes, or I think it's the last or near the end, with A Ghost of Your Old Dog, which is it's an incredibly short piece. It's a flash fiction piece, and it's almost like a thought poem, or it's an emotional poem. It's just this kind of meditative circle of a man, and he's traversing a circle in snow and comes upon I think the bloody footprints or the ghost, maybe not the ghost yet, or he just finds the prints of his old dog. And they're incredibly different tonal and incredibly different kinds of stories, yet I felt they somehow belonged together to me. So maybe we'll wrap it up by just telling us a little bit about those two stories, Laird.
Sure. I just wanted to include Soul of Me just because I felt it was a strong story. And I love Rex, the protagonist of that, the semi-immortal dog. And the thing about Rex is he usually that's his whole thing, that he's the last canine, and he carries genetic memory of every dog that ever lived, every canine that ever existed, theoretically, in a quantum state. And so he frequently dies. I've written several stories about him, and he almost all I think he dies in every single one of them. But that's the thing, is that it doesn't really matter. He'll be a schnauzer. This time he's a 300-pound cyborg. Next time he comes back, maybe it's another point in the timeline. Maybe he was a schnauzer. Maybe he's a poodle. I mean, or a Doberman Pinscher. We don't know. And it was just fun to write about him. There was no.
I mean, yeah, you got to have Rex fighting a T-Rex.
Yeah, and and for me, that's just one of those stories that it could have been left out of the collection, but I felt like including it, and also because it forms this weird sort of, at least in symmetry, it forms like a trilogy with Stride and Collar, which has the very prominent dog character and canine character, and then of course Not a Speck, and they're all Not a Speck and Stride and Collar are direct sequels of one another. But
okay.
Yeah, and of course, and then the last story, You Won't Be Saved by the Ghost of Your Old Dog, is simply, that's a very purgatorial, like it's almost like it's like a coda to Not a Speck of Light, just a story down, like a hidden stinger almost. I almost asked Doug Morano, the publisher, to leave it off the title card, but we ended up putting it in there anyway. But yeah, that one.
Oh, that would be fun. That would be fun to have. Be like, wait, it's not.
I've done that.
How do you do a hidden story in okay, yeah, it's like
you just don't have you just leave it off the table of contents, and then you have it.
For those people who actually flip through those pages, like, could it be? Yes, bonus.
Yeah, Nightshade did that for me with my Imago sequence.
Okay,
in some version of the Imago sequence, or maybe it was occultation. I can't remember, but I think it's Imago sequence. In some versions of it, there's been like multiple reprints or editions. It's all left off the table of contents, and it's like a couple blank pages after the last story, and then there it is.
Well, I'm gonna have to go back to my bookshelf to see if I know or have forgotten if I have the bonus stories or not. Thank you so much for that little Easter egg. But yeah, we're right on the hour mark, so I think we'll wrap it up. Laird, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you about these stories. The book is not a speck of light. It's the newest book of short stories by Laird Barron. Laird, where can people connect with you and connect with the book? And do you have a favorite bookstore or indie bookstore that you like?
I like Inquiring Minds in New Paltz. You can also get it directly from the publisher, at least the electronic edition, the digital edition. You can get me at my Patreon, Laird Barron at patreon.com. Also, I'm on Facebook and under my name and Blue Sky.
Fantastic, Laird. We wish you all the best in 2025. Continued good health in your recovery, and continued success and inspiration in your fiction. To everyone who tuned in, please stay inspired, stay safe, stay strange, and we'll see you back here in 2025. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night, guys.
Thanks a lot, Laird.